welcome to everyone joining us. This is Derek Olson, the president of WorldOregon. We'll get started in just a minute. We're still gathering participants, so bear with us a minute as we have all the attendees join us, and we'll start the program in just a minute. Good afternoon and welcome everyone. My name is Derek Olson and I'm the president of WorldOregon. And it's an honor to have you with us today for a very important and challenging discussion, combating systemic racism, how we can do better. Before we dive into the program, I wanted to talk about a few ground rules for how we approach Zoom webinars at WorldOregon, if you haven't participated in one before. As you know, this is a Zoom webinar, which means all attendees' audio and video is turned off. The only audio and video will be those of WorldOregon staff, myself, and the panelist and moderator. You can ask questions to the panelists and the moderators through the Q&A function, or if you have a relevant link to an article or something, you can post it in the chat. After the panelist and the moderator have gone through their initial part of the program, we will start incorporating questions from the audience through our program director, Tim DeRoche, who will be monitoring the Q&A and reading those questions to the moderator and the panelists. So we encourage you to engage with those questions. This program is being recorded for a future possible posting on YouTube. So we will appreciate your acknowledgement of that. I also note at the end of this webinar, we will have an optional Zoom call with discussion groups for the audience to be able to discuss more what they've heard and comments they may have. We will post the link for that. It also should have been in the registration link you received. That second Zoom breakout session, that will not be recorded because we want to be able to have candid discussions, and so that will be just in the moment. This first webinar will be recorded. And now to the program, combating systemic racism, how we can do better. And I'd like to read what we sent out to our community as we prepared for this program to encourage you to join us. As an organization with a global mission to connect Oregon with the world, and not one involved in delivering direct services, it's not always easy to know what to do in the face of injustice in our own backyard, like the recent murder of George Floyd and countless others by police. The undeniable fact is we've seen just the latest African-American to die needlessly at the hands of those trusted to serve and protect, and that systemic racism continues to harm people of color, especially Black people, across the country and the world. We firmly believe that Black lives matter, and we stand with United Nations Secretary General António Guterres' recent statement that, quote, racism is an abhorrence we must all reject, unquote. While WorldOregon strives to expose xenophobia, explicit and structural racism, tyranny, and threats to healthy democracy, and seeks to empower all of our communities to tell their stories to the world, at the end of the day, we still have to ask ourselves, have we failed to create an anti-racist environment in our midst? Have we made anti-racism a priority as an organization? How do we become a more responsive conduit for stories of injustice? How can we do better? And what are the possible next steps? This honest and challenging panel discussion on what the role of internationally oriented nonprofits in general, and WorldOregon specifically, can play in calling out and addressing anti-Black injustices and how this moment can be a fulcrum from change should be a very powerful discussion. Our moderator today is Linda Castillo, who is with Castillo Consulting. She has a great deal of experience in this area and serves on the WorldOregon Board of Advisors. Our stellar panelists include Dr. Alicia Moreland-Capuya, who is Executive Director of the OHSU Abel Gordley Center for Healing, and is also engaged in many other organizations in the city. Saba Salim, Strategic Associate with Mandate Media, who also serves on WorldOregon's Young Professional Steering Committee, and Jimet Dogo, who's the Director of ERCO Africa House and is partnered with WorldOregon on many international visitors programs. A reminder that after the program, we will have an optional Zoom breakout rooms for follow-up discussion among the attendees. And now without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic to Linda and look forward to the discussion.
Good afternoon and hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this WorldOregon webinar and this very important and timely discussion. These are singular yet very familiar times, and many of us may be feeling fairly raw or reeling or vulnerable in this place, dealing with this pandemic that's akin to the one we faced in 1918, and reliving the painful and heroic reality of racism and failed justice. It may still be difficult to process the feelings and understand where we are as a city, as a county, as a country. While we are in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, there is no denying we are at a tipping point of change. And as a community, we must determine how we move towards the arc of change, toward justice, and to co-create what Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King described as the beloved community, a society which requires collective, unwavering intention and action based on justice, equal opportunity, and love for one's fellow human being. Indeed, we're at a crossroads. So that's why this conversation today is so important. And I'm so happy to welcome these three incredibly special panelists. We have with us Dr. Alicia Moreland-Kapua. As Derek mentioned, is the Executive Director over at Avell Gordley Center. She's also developed a violence prevention program based on a public health approach called Healing Hurt People. And it's a program that serves youth from 10 to 25 years old, youth of color. And she also wrote a book titled Training for Change, Transforming Systems, Trauma-Informed, Culturally Responsive, and Neuroscientifically Focused. Our other guest is Jimmy Dugo, who arrived to Portland quite a number of years ago from Chad as a political asylee. And he has been very instrumental in work in Chad and certainly here in Portland. At a very young age, he's been devoted to brokering peace and nonviolence through his organization, Chad Nonviolence. And Saba Salim, who arrived to Portland from Pakistan at a very young age, who's currently a strategic associate at Mandate Media. We're very happy to have you join us today. And I'd like to offer you the opportunity to provide some opening remarks. Is there someone who would like to go first? Dr. Alicia?
To start. Thank you so very much, Derek, Linda, and Tim for inviting me to participate in this panel today, and to my fellow panelists, Saba and Jimmy. Honored to be here with all of you. I have to admit in this starting conversation that today I found myself exhausted. And I, usually I try to hide that, but today, not so much. I'm tired, but I hope that even through the tiredness, one can appreciate this very specific point. Oftentimes, historically and traditionally, those who are wounded are also expected to do the teaching and the healing. And I think that as we move forward in this new wave of what we can do to thoughtfully deconstruct this very powerful social construct of racism, that it should also take into consideration redistribution of the labor around and heavy lifting for these particular issues. And I do believe that today's discussion is a step in the right direction. I will also say that I have been very clear that racism is the persistent pandemic. As you've mentioned, Linda, COVID-19 never left. We saw that it disproportionately impacted Black citizens and Black Americans and people of color. And one of the things that we then saw is what I have called acute on chronic, that there is a continued persistent pandemic, meaning that it impacts the whole world. And we see that because we've seen protests in Norway, in London, in parts of Africa, all around the world. Folks have come to say, we acknowledge this pain, we acknowledge the history, and we want change. So I am super excited. I think that this discussion is appropriate given this time. And I am hopeful that getting beyond the discussion, that we get to what can be done and to increase the laborers in this work. You know, I've been doing this work for a long time, and one of the key things that I've always asked for is I said, you know, I know what's going on, and I've rolled up my sleeves to do the work and continue to do the work. And my plea has always been, and it's consistent today, is who is willing to join me? And now that we have the attention of a wider WIDER audience, I'm hoping that everyone's willing to roll up their sleeves and to do the hard work and the heavy lifting. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you, Dr. Alicia. Jimmy, would you like to go next?
Yes, again, like what Dr. Capullo said, thank you all. And I am myself also feel exhausted. And as Linda said, I came to this country 21 years ago, and just 6 months into living in Portland, I was full of, I was working part-time at the airport, and I have all my TSA uniform and all those in my car, and at the airport, 4 police, you know, Portland police trooper follow me, and then all their gun drawn, yelling, screaming, and I was so shaken coming, especially, you know, escaping one of the most terrible dictatorship in Africa, standing against the president, and I have to flee my country with the help of American embassy. When I saw this happen, the first thing come in my mind, did the Chadian government send the killer to eliminate me? Because so many of other colleagues of mine who are human rights activists being killed overseas this way. So this, the first thing came to my mind, seeing all those guns in my face and all those being handcuffed, put in the police, you know, car for 3 hours. My car had been towed by Portland police for a week before I went to the city, explained to the situation. The police came, apologized because they said, oh, I fit the description of the person they are looking for. So I was new, I was so scared. So I didn't know that a civilian, you know, can sue the police, can sue the government. So I was so scared, and I didn't do anything. I just accept the apology. So I realized that, and then I started learning about Oregon history. That's why I found out that racism profiling is embedded in Oregon history and is part of the system. And I am too exhausted, especially with the recent, you know, event, and it's hard for me even to talk about this issue to my children. I came from a country where there is no majority, no minority. We are all the same. Even the foreigner, like a European who live in my country, we treat them equally like everybody else. And yet, when I came here expecting that I'm gonna get the same treatment, is completely different. I live racism every day of my life, either at the workplace or either at the outside in the store, everywhere I go. So again, it's really affecting my mental health, my well-being, and also affecting me physically. We just had a meeting this morning before this conference regarding this issue with the African community and with Africa's staff. People are emotional, people are crying. Every single one of us experience racism and anti-Blackness. So this is a real issue, and we need to start, you know, having reimagination as well as a new approach to start discussing this issue. And again, like Dr. Capullo said, we see a lot of support. We have people who are in power supporting. We have also people who for so long being silent or being silenced are coming up in support of anti-Blackness, of racism, and we hope that something will change soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Jimmy. Salba, would you like to share some remarks?
Yes, thank you, Linda. First, I want to thank WorldOregon for allowing me the opportunity to be here today. I'm incredibly Thankful to be on the same panel as Jimmy Dogo, and of course my inspiration, Dr. Alicia Moreland Capuya. So thank you for that. It's important to me that this discussion is centered around anti-Blackness today, specifically, and just how we undo the system that made us believe that such a thing could exist. So a little bit about me. I think, Jimmy, you and we came to the US in the same year. I believe it was 21 years ago, but I was 8 at the time. It was a drastic contrast from growing up in Pakistan. I was 8 when I started school in 2nd grade here in Portland. I was also 8 when I was called a sand nigger for the first time. I was 10 when that term turned into terrorist. For the entirety of 4th and 5th grade, I had to be walked to and from school by a white male classmate because the bullying that came in the aftermath of 9/11 just made it too difficult for me as a little 10-year-old girl to be by myself. In 6th grade, I was bullied out of a class for being called a terrorist. In high school, a teacher told me to be quiet because the kid who had just recently referred to my dad as bin Laden was just trying to get a reaction out of me. So it's important to me that as a Portlander, I grew up here, I consider myself a Portlander, I consider myself an American. It's important to me that I have an eye to the world, and I want to make sure we understand that this isn't just a problem that's happening in Minneapolis. This is, we have our own Quinnies Hayes, and we have Tamir Rice. We have our own issues that are desperately in need of fixing, because we too have individuals who are being sacrificed at the sake of racism. In Oregon, we have a very white history. It may have banned slavery at its inception, but the racism at the core cannot be ignored. All you need to do is look at the laws that excluded Black people from being welcomed, from not allowing already existing Oregonians to live within certain areas, to not allowing migrants from the East to settle here, and even the stronghold of the KKK on the local government until very recently. I want to make sure that Oregon is aware, Oregon and even the United States is very aware that as much as we like to portray ourselves in this savior light, that unfortunately we just don't live up to that image, and we have a lot of work to do to fix that. In the US, we have a tendency to go to these other countries, which we call third world countries, that have been plagued by war and so many other issues, that we want to come in and save their issues, but we're not addressing those exact same issues we have right here. The continued vilification of people of color, and especially Black people in this country it's atrocious at very minimum. So we're calling on people to come together to uphold the truth, simply so me and people like me who have my skin color and people who are much darker can just live. I don't want the world in WorldOregon to just be an oxymoron. I want us to live up to our name and our ideals, and that means representation of all the people that live here. We have had a huge increase in the population of Oregon in the last 2 to 3 decades. And of course, with that, the population of communities of color have significantly grown. But we don't really see that in the leadership that we have. And if we don't have that in leadership, how do we start leading those conversations that get us to the results? So, I had a lot of conflicts when I was initially asked to be on this panel. Because I wanted the conversation to be around anti-Blackness, and as you can see, I'm not Black, and I questioned, should I be here? And maybe I shouldn't. Maybe this spot should be made available for a Black person. but you know, I want to make sure that I, in my many privileges of being a lighter skin, of being in this position with WorldOregon, and just within the political community, that I am using my position in power to really empower those who haven't been empowered, who have been suppressed in the past, and you know, they're being able to speak their truth and fight for their lives. So I just want to make sure that we're reaching out and turning over agency to people who truly represent the community.
Thank you so much, everyone, for those opening remarks. I know we provided you some very lengthy questions in advance. We're very ambitious in what we try to capture, but you know, as you can, respond to these questions. So for Dr. Morlin Kapua, the first question we have for you, as witnesses to the murder of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and its aftermath, we are experiencing traumatic events in real time. Racist microaggressions, violence, and the loss of previous lives have revived old wounds and created new ones. Racism trauma is a multi-layered and deeply embedded in our American experience. How can we become a more responsive conduit for the stories of injustice? How is racism connected to public health challenges like COVID-19 for Black, Indigenous, and people of color? Dr. Alicia.
It's a very ambitious question. We will, I will try to be as judicious as possible to make sure I address all of them. There are a few things I want to say to preface the answer to that question, and that is, I think that we have to really pay close attention to narrative and what we're really asking. Because the more clear we are in what we are asking, the more likely we are to get it, right? So there has to be understanding. And so I want to submit to the group and all of the participants with us today that there's a distinction between racism, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Those are vastly different things. And also, tokenism is not a way to effectively combat racism. So I strongly felt like I wanted to put that out there, to put a Black face in a place and in a position of leadership without creating the conditions to support their overall success over a sustained period of time is not the way. And so, and it also to put a Black leader in a place and to assume that it is a second or third option or third tier option is also not the way. So Sherry Dunn, who was the former executive director of Dress for Success, just recently launched her own consulting firm. And I want to repeat it and I want to amplify her and her work because she said something that I thought will be useful, and she is a resource, because I want to make sure that folks have resources when they leave here today of where you can go if you're really interested in doing the work of deconstructing, because that's what's going to be required, not combating, but deconstructing. And so Sherry says, and this is on her, just featured in the Business Journal, Portland Business Journal. She said, oftentimes companies say that they have to have, that African Americans specifically have to be coached in order to get to a leadership position. And she said, I don't actually think that's accurate. I want to be the one doing the coaching of the institutions. So because they need the coaching so that they can create the environments and the conditions for African American leaders. So it's about a reframe and narrative. And that's my earnest hope today, is that through the fatigue, through the tiredness, I'm willing to come, first of all, because I respect Derek and his work. Linda, I respect everything that your history is incredible as well. And I was willing to make the sacrifice today because I believe that there would be a willingness of the participants today to listen. And listening really is so closely related to love. Listening is a form of love. And what we're asking folks to do is to do more listening, to do more loving, and to demonstrate that love through action. So now I just had to get that out. Now to answer the question, thank you so much for giving me that moment. When we talk about trauma, I oftentimes get fearful because I don't believe that everyone really has a shared understanding or experience of like what that means. And so to the base, because what I want to do at the end of the day, my time is precious, your time is precious, it's the one thing we can't get back, is I want something to change. What compelled our presence here today is not because we just want to have a nice conversation. We want something to change. So I'm going to do a exercise as a means of moving us through getting to a shared understanding, and then that will be the base for the rest of the discussion. So oftentimes I start my conversations, I do a lot of training, and I start by asking folks, I usually ask, is there anybody in this room that has never been afraid? And I know we've got about 108 participants, so I'm going to ask you that question. I know you can't answer, but most of the time, I'm going to say 100% of the time, no one in that room has ever raised their hand to say that they have never been afraid. So now we've got a shared experience. Everybody has experienced fear at some point in their lives, and they know what it's like to be so afraid. Then I ask them, when you were afraid, what did it feel like? And people start to describe it. I mean, all people, rich, those who are not so rich, those who are educated, those who may not have all the education, but the experience is shared. They said, you know, we feel it in our bodies. We're not thinking straight. We're not able to fully execute the things that we want to execute. It is difficult to make it, you're not doing, let's just be honest, you're not doing calculus when you're afraid. And so at that time, and I said, well, what did your heart feel like? They start to describe what their heart feels like. They start to describe what it feels like in their body and their breathing. So everybody at some point has had that shared experience. And then I explained to folks that fear, and I'm getting to trauma, just follow me, we're going somewhere. Then I say to folks that fear is meant to be a time-limited response. It is meant to be something that turns on in reaction to a perceived or real threat. That's what it helps us to actively seek safety. That's the role of fear. And it does have a functional role, but catch this, until it doesn't. So the question then becomes further is, after the perceived threat or the real threat is gone, what should happen to us? Right? Ideally, and I'm doing air quotes, we should get back to a place where our body feels comfortable, where we can function, where we might be able to, some of us couldn't do calculus before, but I won't hold that against you. But we should be able to think straight, at least, to be comfortable, right? That is what should happen. But then there is something that happens that is more prevalent. Now that you understand fear and you've experienced it and you can describe it, then I am more readily able to ask you, well, what do you think happens if that fear never goes away? If you are fearful 24/7, 365 days of the year. Can you imagine? That's the real conversation that I'm wanting America and the world to have. Can you imagine what that feels like? You've already told me that you've been afraid in your life, but now can you imagine what it's like to be afraid every single day? Okay, that's racism. That's what the powerful social construct of racism does. It keeps you in a constant state of fear. And what we know, and what I know as a neuroscientist and someone who studies neurobiology, is fear that doesn't turn off. That's the neurobiological definition of trauma, right? And that's what America has experienced time and time again. And I'm going to say specifically Black Americans. So when we see the image of Mr. Floyd having a knee on his neck, breathing his last breath, and I'm not going to say breathing, he had his last breath stolen from him in such a violent, inhumane way. We are reminded once again that fear of why we should be afraid, of why we don't feel seen, of why we don't feel heard, of why we don't feel valued, of why we believe that that the citizenship to humanity is not something that applies to us. That has to change. And I'm saying that if you understand that feeling, and you know that it's not something that you could live with every day, that should compel you to want to do something. Okay, it's like having Freddy Krueger. I'm just give one last example, and I'm coming to a close here. But it's like Freddy Krueger running, or any said character in a scary movie. You've got the monster running behind you. You've got the said character with the keys in the hand, trying to get into the keys into the lock. And when they get to the door, what happens to the keys? Abba, what happens to the keys? Do they get the key in the lock? They drop the darn keys. They don't, right? And so we're yelling at the screen, you better get those keys. But the reality is that when I'm afraid, when I am that afraid, when I've got the threat running after me every day, if it's Freddy Krueger or whatever, Jason, all those scary movies, The part of the brain that's responsible for helping me get that key in the lock, that motoric sophistication, that part of the brain helps to lead that, it's not working when I'm afraid. So I want, if you can understand that phenomenon, that's what it's like to be Black around the world. That you're always running from Freddy Krueger. Everything is a threat, and everything feels like a threat. But here's the even more tragic part. Even in feeling afraid, you are still expected to function. You are still expected to excel. You are still expected to leap over mountains and then get ready to climb the next. You are still expected. The bar keeps moving for you, even though you live in an environment where you have to deal with the soft bigotry of low expectation. When we see these images of George, it is a silent reminder. It serves to trigger fear, but it also serves to numb people to the feeling that that is a life, that somebody loved that man. He has a daughter. He has a family. Somebody cared about his life. It's easy to justify and get numb to that kind of behavior when you watch it over and over again. It's like your mind gets used to, oh, another person casually dies on the street. And I would say resist that notion, resist that temptation to go to a numb place where you start to justify why inhumanity would ever be a choice for any of us. So, lastly, I said at the beginning part of this that the persistent pandemic, the one that impacts all of the world, the one that has all of the impact on all of the social determinants of health, is racism. And I know we're talking about the police as one system and the criminal justice system, but I also want us to remember that there are so many Black kids in this country whose dreams were killed by an education system that had their knee on their necks. That there are so many Black men and women who go to work every day and try to do the best they can to take care of their families, and that metaphorical knee has taken the life out of them as well. So there is a larger social economic discussion. There's a larger structural discussion. Racism is only held up and reinforced by multiple structures that reinforce them. The police and the criminal justice system is just one of many. And I hope that everyone, whatever circle of influence you have and whatever system you work in, are committed to effectively looking at that. And it's not enough to just talk about being anti-racist, because I think that's a box that everybody can just check off. It's now a buzzword. And I love my brother who wrote the book. I think he's incredible. But when I ask folks, well, what does that mean? Nobody has an answer. I'm saying before we get to anti-racist, can we just get to human decency? Can we get to human decency? So I'll stop there, and thank you for the question.
Thank you, Dr. Morgan Kapua. Much appreciated. For our next question is for Jimmy Dugal. By facing our racial history and our racial past, we will have made anti-racism a priority? That's a question. If not, then how can we create an anti-racist environment, or are we focusing on the wrong issue? How can we do better, and what are the possible next steps?
Thank you, Linda, and also thank you, Dr. Kapua. It's amazing what you just said, especially for a new American like me. So, and as I said earlier, after the incident that I have with police, I start, learning about history of America, as well as particularly the history of Oregon. And I find out that racism is embedded in our fabric through our Oregon history, to policy, and through the way, decision or people in power act. I believe, honestly, I believe that had we faced, our racial past honestly and with commitment, we may not be today at in this situation. We should have, anti-racism, anti-Blackness as a priority, so that we can create an anti-racist environment where everybody should, enjoy any opportunity that was given to them in this country. It's a citizen-free nations, but you look at their practice, we are not emulating those value, those freedom, and even if we're emulating, it's not for a certain group of people. So I believe that we can fight racism if the people in power have commitment to do so. But too often what we see, in our culture, and particularly what I see happening in America or here in Oregon, and particularly here in Portland, we often, too often our cultural view of social problem, we see cultural view of social problem through an individual lens. We keep asking, what did person do to deserve his or her specific condition or circumstances? But we know that history, policy, culture, and many other, factors beyond individual choice have gotten us to where we are today. So often we jump into conclusion, to show that the experience of discrimination and racism by pointing out, racial or racially unequal condition, or particularly important to tell, full story that link the cause, like the history or the effect, the outcome. So without, those, this important link, some audience can walk away believing that, healthcare, criminal justice system, educational system, like Dr. Kapuya talked about it, are just fine. Therefore, a different outcome exists because people of color are maybe, or Black people are doing something wrong. So I personally, witnessed racism at all levels, just like Dr. Kapuya said, either educations or work. At any level of my 21 years, of living here in Oregon. And we also so often, people carry, implicit bias or unconscious, stereotype. And it's those bias, go interrupted. And because we did not take a serious, stand against racism, so many people continue to be indifferent, that things are just normal. And you can see this even in the workplace. So I believe that the deep wound, of racism can be healed in the process, even though the process is very, intricate, deliberate, but also require, like Doctor said, involvement of those with power and privilege, We, who especially have remained silent. We keep hearing a lot of people in power and privilege now saying that we are anti-racist, and we are marching with the Black, Lives Matter, but we need concrete actions. We need those people with privilege and power to help us and help, change the system. It's painful to see, the murder of George Floyd, and it reopened, painful wound, especially for, our African American community who've been living for hundreds of years. I've been here only 21 years, and I'm exhausted. I'm hurt, with 21 years, like the doctor said, 365 days, just witnessing those kind of racism. So how long, how many times will the mourner, need to participate in candlelight vigil? How long we gonna, continue with this situation? Are we gonna wait till, 2042 when the white became minority, then we're gonna have a change? We're gonna continue to suffer. So the history is particularly history of Oregon is racist history, anti-Black history, and Oregon is based on white-only state. So there are some people still believing in this. So people, responsible for our justice system have to have a resolute, a commitment to equal treatment and investigation based on violence, not stereotype or bias. I am going to be short, but I want to say that racism, is precisely, does not only reside on individual choice, but it's on the system, the systemic structure that we see in every single one of our institutions. So we see racism in collective racism, at the civic level, governmental level. We see how, officials respond to every life, from traffic violation to college admission, to which mother are, cared for during the childbirth, to which are left to die, to which children are disproportionately disciplined in school, to which type of hairdo is considered appropriate in school or at the workplace, to who is perceived loud and angry in the classroom or at the workplace, to who can run, nap, read, or watch bird in peace. So racism is embedded, in its father, which is the white supremacist, and which is rooted in our fabric and in our every aspect of our life. So eradicating racism, we need to confront it directly. The structure that sustain each individual or collective racist act, we need to face them. We need to combat them directly. So to create better racial, environment, it is to our state, even our nation, interest to ensure that everyone enjoy full and equal opportunity. But this is not what's happening in our education system today, where children of color, face overcrowded classroom, uncertified, teacher, and excessive discipline far more than the white, classmate. So if we don't attend those inequality while improving education for our children, we will never become, a nation that aspires to what they need to be. So again, just like Doctor said, we need, a decision maker and people in power and privilege to stand up firm and make, commitment to change the system that allow racism to sustain for so many years. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. So we have a question for Saba as well. We have a country trapped in a cycle of intermittent racial progress and backlash. How do we address the denial of the scale and severity of racial injustice that Black people and people of color endure here in the United States and in the world?
So people view racism as a Black issue, as a non-white issue, but in its entirety, it's not. It's a white supremacy issue. It's about whiteness and what that has done to get us here today. Until we can do everything needed to undo that, we cannot move forward. Even this question, great question, but I do want to make sure that we're looking at everything in a proper way. So even this question to me is framed in a very passive way to sound as if racism is just something that happens to BIPOC instead of something that was created through generations of exclusion, superiority, and supremacy. I would encourage each of us to ask ourselves who is denying racism, who is minimizing its impact and downplaying the longevity of the trauma. Who is going to start? So we're going to start with this experiment. In my personal experience, I have noticed some trigger words that have caused particularly white audiences to shut down when these conversations happen. And this is just a list of things that I've seen with my own eyes. Diversity, privilege, white people, white supremacy, politics, and white fragility. So one of the things I want us in the audience to really notice is that how our body reacts when someone within a conversation says those words. Because you know we have a problem when the words white people make white people uncomfortable. So the next time you engage in a conversation with someone about the Black Lives Matter movement or just diversity, just addressing what we can do about it, I want you to look and feel what your body is feeling in that moment. And I want you to notice the changes. I want you to sit in that discomfort. It will feel personal and incredibly difficult to discuss. It'll be lonely and your ego will be challenged and you will feel personally attacked by everyone in the world. And I want you to do it anyways, because that is how individuals of color, how Indigenous people, how Black people, how Latinos, how Asian people, even in these recent months under coronavirus, have felt for a very, very long time. I want us to remember intent versus impact. This is a question I want us to continue to come back to, because a lot of the times when people say that they are not racist, what they mean is that they did not intend to be racist. But if what you said and what you're doing is based on generations of trauma and generations of systems that are there to oppress entire populations while elevating you, what you intended doesn't matter. Your impact is very, very problematic. So I want us to, when we feel that way in those conversations, I want us to remember that, and I want us to do better. And one of the things that's really important for me out of this forum is that not only are we having these difficult discussions, I want us to walk away with actionable items. It's not enough to just march in the streets. We have to vote for the people who are in power, making the laws that are harming these people. You know, we can't just turn our profile pictures Black for one day. What we need to do is we need to educate ourselves on the entire history of what's been happening, and we need to, you know, look at what's already, it's easy to Google. We can look for the resources, but how are we divesting from funding these systems that uphold, you know, generations of white supremacy, and investing in communities of color and our Black communities? So I want us to walk away with these actionable items. So one of the things that I wanted to compare racism, it's really a pandemic, is maybe treat it like the coronavirus. So baseline, everyone assumed that we have it at the very minimum. Once you get past that, you'll understand that it's not just you. Everyone should assume that we have it. Then I want you to listen to experts who are talking to you about it, who have studied this for you know, generations, who have experienced it every single day of their life. And from there, don't spread it. Do everything within your power to keep this right here. And lastly, just be willing to change your life so that you can save other people's lives. Because if you're not willing to do that, people are literally dying in our streets. We've had thousands of people arrested because of the protests, but we've had maybe, 0 cops arrested because of the police brutality in the last few months. So I want us to really think about the actions that we take every single day. Are we calling out even the microaggressions that are happening in the workplace? Because I get it, it's hard to do that, especially when something like your job and your livelihood is on the line. But if those of us who are, like Jimette said, if those of us who are in positions of power, if we're not doing that, nothing changes. And we are honestly at an impasse right now, because if we don't change it, things are burning to the ground. And that's just the reality of the situation.
Thank you so much, Sabah. Thank you all panelists for these very enlightening and important conversations and recommendations, and giving us some visceral feedback about what this is like, and even some exercises and how folks can start to get in touch at the very top level of what this is like. It's so deep, it's so dense. I'm going to turn it over now to Tim, who's going to have some questions that are posed from the audience.
Great. Thank you, Linda, and thank you, panelists. Really been an amazing conversation. I'm going to jump right in. Chick Tech asks, thank you to these fantastic panelists for sharing their time, thoughts, and energy. Do you have any suggestions for having difficult conversations about racism with loved ones who do not understand how important it is to actively combat systemic racism?
Yeah, I'll start. First, I'll say, if any system, person, individual is wanting a sort of a roadmap, go buy the book, available. Number two, I think I started part of this conversation. I don't think I've ever seen anything in history change amongst challenge, amongst comfort and convenience, but amongst challenge and controversy. But I also know that when things feel salient, most of the time we're poised to make a change. What we understand about human behavior is I'm more poised to make a change when I understand how it impacts me. So we're at WorldOregon. I believe that everyone who's tuned in at least has some concept of the global community and appreciates it and respects it. At one point when COVID-19 started, and I think, Saba, I appreciate your frame, the metaphor of treating racism like COVID-19 in terms of tracking, tracing, measuring, preventing, all that good stuff, treating and managing. So I want to further that point by saying, at the beginning, folks thought, oh, that's something that's impacting folks over there, right? And then quickly it came to America's shores and folks began to be, I mean, communities were ravaged. And it's like for the first time, folks understood that what happens in other parts of the world impacts us as well. So we have a moral and a human responsibility to support the overall wellness of all nations, right? And so if that's what we are, if that is our goal, we should be concerned about making sure that the healthcare infrastructure and the political infrastructure and all of these infrastructures, the economic infrastructure is well established in other countries, but also more important, it's down to the basic level. I started out by asking the question, who among you has never been afraid? If you can understand, I have found that most of the time it is not an empathy gap. 50% of the time it's not an empathy gap, it's an understanding gap. And so the goal is, how do I increase understanding? Because where we increase understanding, we increase the risk for change. So I tug at the heartstrings. I know people don't like to be vulnerable or have to be in the feeling space, but what I'll submit to you all is that's the feeling space, that's the birthplace for change. So if you can tell me what it was like the last time you were afraid, and you can identify with that, you have effectively already increased your capacity for empathy. You now can understand. And so I'm like, now can you take that a little bit further and understand that that fear that you have felt is something that people among you, and namely Black citizens, feel every single day. And you know it's not comfortable for you. And so what I would suggest is racism is certainly the subtext, and we need to be talking about it. Diversity and inclusion, yes. However, I think that folks are more likely, that's one lens that we certainly have to not ignore, but the wider lens is trauma. Everyone can meet you there. And if you can get that and understand trauma, fear and trauma, then eventually you can get to a place where you understand that racism is a very severe form of trauma. And so there's again, in my textbook, I break that down in ways that everyone can sort of gather around. And then I give you some very practical examples. I'm gonna do a Toni Morrison on you all today. If you want answers, it's all in the book. And it is. So I'll stop there.
This is a great question. And I want to give an example. When I bought my house in 2008, I moved to my neighborhood, and my neighborhood is white, and there are also few immigrants. So my right, neighbor, a 97 years old white lady, walked up to me, and we start talking, because then she said, well, this is the first time she's seeing a Black person, buying house in this neighborhood. especially she's been living there for 32 years. Then she started telling me about the history of the neighborhood. And then she said, you know, what's your name? I said, Jimmy. She says, Jimmy, you know, you see those, the family, the house, 2 houses across you? I said, yes. Said, those Asian, I hate them. They eat everything. They ate my, I suspect them for eating my dog. They eat everything that has 4 legs except table. And then she said, I hate those Russian, Ukrainian. They make a lot of noise because they fix their car on the street and then affecting traffic. And then he said she hates those Mexican because they never learn English. And then she said she hates people of color because there are people of color that pass by and they step on her flower. And then I told her that, hey, Grandma Betty, do you know that I am a person of color? So she said, no, I'm not talking about you. You're not the regular one. I'm talking about our Black people, not you. And then she goes on to say, so how much money Obama gave you to buy this house? So I befriend her, but all the neighbors who are people of color were mad that I'm sitting down with a racist person. But what I found out about my neighbor is that she dropped out of school at the 3rd grade level, and she worked as a bartender all her life. She never left Oregon. She'd been watching Fox News all her life. She left Oregon twice in her 87 years of life to go to Arizona for breast cancer treatment. So I sat down with her to teach her about, you know, my culture, where we came from, and she should also know me very well before she can start, you know, talking about stereotype. So learning about other people and their culture beyond just food and festival is very important. I brought Betty in my house. We share food. I took her to African event, African film festival. When people are visiting my house, I bring her to talk to other, you know, Black folks. Grandma Betty completely changed. She became one of the nicest person, and she apologized to me, said, Jimmy, I never had a person of color friend in my life. This is the first time I'm talking to a person of color. So those are the things that people need to start learning about other people's culture. People need to start being the role model, you know, for their children. Educate, you know, other and educate their children about their own experience and about, you know, hurtful message that are coming from either their children or their friend or their neighbor. So, and then to do something, don't let others get away with biased language or behavior. Speak up and speak out and take position against hate and stand, you know, against racism. Those are the things that, you know, people who do not, you know, experience what we are going through to help us during this difficult time that we're going through. Thank you.
Thank you, Jimmy.
Tim,
Tim, I think we have just a couple of more minutes. Can you maybe give us a little bit of a time check?
no, I think we're doing fine. I've got a couple more questions I'd like to throw out there. Linda, who is a teacher, not you, Linda, asks, how does domestic racism affect our international relations, and or what could our organization or our role be to positively affect that effect?
I'm happy to start. I think each of us on the panel have had very worldly experiences. I myself have lived in Ireland and Spain at different times. And I'll be honest, it's not great. While there's still the superior image of the U.S. that, you know, the entire world has, and the desire to come here because our visa is just, nothing else in the world compares to it. The world is not blind to what's going on now. The world is not blind to the American ways. The world is not blind to what's happening to communities of color. When Ferguson was happening just a few years ago, I was living in Ireland, and there were European countries who were listing the US, and particularly more rural parts, as a very dangerous place to visit for someone of a darker skin, and especially African Americans. So we have made those lists as dangerous countries for people to visit several times. We see with these protests, we have 18 or 19 countries who are marching in the streets with us. That's not by accident. And I think because of it's our obligation to live up to our name of, not our name, our claim of being the greatest country in the world. We have to step up and we have to do better, because at one point, I'm sure we were the most powerful country in the world, but we have defunded education for the last nearly 30 years I've been alive, every single year, while our funding in military and police force continue to increase. We defund healthcare systems. We are kicking people off of the most basic healthcare, and taking people's social security away that they have been working for their entire lives. People are noticing, is all I'm saying, beyond our walls, and they're seeing the same thing that white Americans are seeing here. The sooner we go straight into fixing that, the better we can actually fix our global image. And of course, that starts not just by each of us making that difference within our community, but also going all the way to the top, because we need to have leaders that represent that diplomacy and humanity that we so desire, that we so need in this country. And if we don't have leaders that do that, then we're just another laughingstock to the world.
Great. I've got two questions which I'm going to sort of mash up a little bit. I've got one from Allison and one from Spencer. Wondering about examples of how white allies can share the labor, both, I mean, she asks about it in the past, but I think in the interest of time, how we can share the labor now. And as an ally, what paths are there for getting, and you've touched on this a little bit, white friends to accept the very existence of systemic racism when they argue that they are not personally racist themselves?
Okay, I think that its repetition is actually really important. I think in our adults, like as we grow up as adults, we forget that that's how we learned our ABCs and our 1, 2, 3s, is we had to repeat things. So I think that there actually is a very clear role for repetition in this large sort of world learning experience, right? And so we're all learning, and so it's totally okay. I think that one of the major important components that really can't be forgotten in this process is, there's some low-hanging fruit, right? And that low-hanging fruit are things that each of us can do as decent human beings. One is we haven't, we got so caught up in George Floyd, which is tragic and painful, but we forgot about Amy Cooper in New York, in the park. And I want to talk about it because maybe it would just, stories are what we call data of the soul. So I want to tell this brief story in the hopes that you can continue to have this conversation, because it is an example of what we're asking for. So I want to go to the basic level. Amy Cooper, for those of you who may have forgotten, was in Central Park with her dog. Another African-American man who happened to be, and it doesn't matter what his education was, but he happened to be a Black man with a Harvard education who understood, studied birds and ornithology and all that really cool stuff. And he asked her to politely not allow her dog to run in areas that dogs should not be. Well, Amy, who we've now come to understand is an individual who's from Chicago, considered herself, by her words only, to be a liberal, progressive individual. Amy, in the height of her anger, frustration, and I'm going to use a word that I know that Saba did educate us earlier on that could potentially be a deterrent, in her privilege, essentially decided that she was not going to listen to this gentleman, got so offended that she said, if you don't stop, they start recording each other, if you don't stop, I'm going to call the police and tell them that and very clearly, that an African-American man is threatening my life. So there is something in us that we have to come to grips with. When we're asked to put a mirror up to our own inhumanity, it is painful, it is scary, and it is not something that we wake up to do, right? Nobody wakes up and is excited to make change, like, oh, I'm so excited to change today. But the mirror has been placed up to each and every one of us. We all have some level of inhumanity that has to be checked, because that inhumanity is literally killing people. So Amy ends up calling the police, and she repeats to the police what she had said she was going to say. There's an African-American man here threatening my life, and he caught it on video. And when he caught it on video, what we discovered together was that it is that low-level, subconscious, unrecognized, untapped rage, privilege, racism, bias that bubbles over. And it could have gotten him killed, but luckily he was able to record it, and it was a different outcome for him. She ended up losing her job and her self-respect and all of those things. I want us to maybe consider the Amy Cooper that may be in all of us. That it is as simple as, I know that there are specific narratives. I know that there are specific words that will inspire certain behavior. The word African-American male was weaponized because it historically has been used as a way to demonstrate threat, danger, inhumanity. And so one of the things that I am begging, I'm imploring people, all of us, to actively think about the words that are used, how we describe folks' narrative, the kitchen table conversations, the Thanksgiving dinners, the casual conversations at the water cooler where people say things that are inappropriate and we don't check it. I'm saying we can all do better. Can we start there? And again, y'all thought I was kidding, but I'm super serious. That's just, like Toni Morrison said, it's in the book. I want you to purchase the book, or at least get a version of it, because I talk about this. There are many of us who've been doing the work well before today. And after the cameras are gone, I want the work to be done. I'm still going to be doing the work. And I've given folks a guide on how to do it. So I invite you, I honestly and kindly invite you to join me in that endeavor.
So for those out there, the book is Training for Change, Transforming Systems to be Trauma-Informed, Culturally Responsive, and Neuroscientifically Focused. And I'm posting a link to it. And Dr. Moreland-Capuia, is there a way in which you would like people to purchase it?
However you like. Springer is the publisher. Some people have issues with Amazon, so you can also order it from any bookstore. Pals has it. You can have Pals order it. You can go to any of your bookstores. Springer's a national, international publisher, so you can get it anywhere. As long as you type it in, they have it pretty much everywhere.
Thank you. So we are at time in terms of Q&A, so I'm going to turn things back over to Derek Olson, and I want to thank all of you for some incredibly rich, stringent, and extremely powerful perspectives.
Thank you. Thank you so much for giving us the opportunity.
Well, it's on behalf of World Oregon, a huge thanks to all of you, Linda for moderating, and our three outstanding panelists. As mentioned, we will be posting this to YouTube later this week, and we'll send out a link to that to our community for those who weren't able to join us. A reminder that we will be having informal, optional breakout discussion that will not be recorded. That is on a follow-up separate Zoom call, not a Zoom webinar. The link for that should have been in the email you received when you registered. It was also posted by Tim in the chat function. So if you're interested in joining us, it will be facilitated by two of our members of Board of Advisors. You can go to the chat function and find the link. It's optional. Again, you do not have to, but we'd love to have those that are interested join for a follow-on chat session. I note that the panelists and moderator, not all of them are able to join. It'll be more sort of a community discussion. Again, a huge thanks to all of you for joining and for supporting the work of World Oregon and helping us to learn how we can do better as a part of this community and the global community. again, a huge thanks for our panelists and moderator, and we look forward to having future discussions on this critical topic. Thank you for joining us today, and stay safe.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Linda.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Stay safe.
Thank you, Linda. Bye.